All right, it's time for the updated top 25. Week 9 edition. The college football season is flying by. Before I put the new rankings for this week, the new Uncle Lou rankings for this week up on the screen, couple of things. The first playoff rankings are getting released 1 week from today. Today's Tuesday as I'm recording this video. The first playoff rankings come out next Tuesday. So, of course, we'll have a lot to say about that, I'm sure, when that comes out. Georgia's not going to be number one in the playoff rankings. There's just no way. The playoff committee, way more so than the AP and the coaches, does tend to focus on this season. And like I have said in almost every single ranking video I have put out this year in the last 4 or 5 weeks, there's nothing about this season that tells you that Georgia is or justifies Georgia being ranked the number 1 team in the country. I don't care whether you're going off of resume, best wins, how they've looked when they've played, who appears to be the most dominant team. Any of those criteria that you would use from this season only, which is what we're supposed to be ranking these teams on, none of those criteria would lead you to rank Georgia as the number 1 team. For that reason, I do not expect Georgia to be number 1. My guess for Georgia first playoff ranking next week will be 3rd. But anyway, this isn't a playoff ranking. I just wanted to people are already starting to ask and talk about next week's playoff rankings, so I figured I'd get that out of the way. Up front here. Per usual, my rankings are mine and mine only. I use a combination of what I think a team deserves to be ranked based on what I've seen them do, combined with where I just feel like a team should be ranked based on how I feel about that team going forward. It's a combination of those two things. There is no one thing I look at when it comes to ranking teams. I obviously look at a team's record. I still believe that winning and losing college football games is what matters and what matters the most. So I value an undefeated team. I value a 1-loss team more than I value a 2-loss team. That doesn't mean that every undefeated team will be ranked ahead of every 1-loss team. That doesn't mean every 1-loss team will be ranked ahead of every 2 team, because it's not the only thing I look at. But that probably is what I weight the most as a team's record. You have to look at the quality wins, right? Which teams have big wins, which teams don't. Which teams have struggled against inferior competition, which teams haven't. I kind of combine all that stuff together, and I come up with what I think is a top 25 ranking of where I feel like teams deserve to be ranked, combined with where I think they should be ranked, and this is what I come up with. Here's this week's top 25. At number 1, I've got Michigan. They've been there for a while. I can't imagine them going away anytime soon. Their schedule is what it is, but when you play a bad team, dominate them, and that's what Michigan has done. So to me, it feels like Michigan not only deserves to be ranked number 1 based on their overall record, undefeated. They haven't had any close games. They've blown out everybody that they've played. I feel like they should and deserve to be ranked number 1. They beat Michigan State this past weekend 49-0. Michigan State ain't no good. I know. So it's a good thing Michigan beat them 49-0. Now, all this cheating type scandal stuff that's going on, what did they do? How wrong was it? What's going to be proven? What's going to happen? I don't know. I'm not going to punish Michigan in a ranking today based on some sort of allegation or ongoing investigation into the cheating situation at Michigan. We all know about it. We've all heard about it. We all have our own opinions on it. I think worst case scenario, if everything that is being alleged or everything that is being reported actually did happen, I think probably someone's going to step in and do something about it. I don't know what that something will be. Cross that bridge when we get there. But right now, just as I have the last several weeks, I've got Michigan ranked number 1. They're on a bye week coming up this week. This week, I moved Ohio State up to number 2. Good win over Penn State. This is their second kind of. This is their second win. I would qualify as a good win. I mean, they beat Notre Dame. You say what you want about Notre Dame. They're a top 15, top 20-ish type of team, right? Ohio State beat them. Now they beat Penn State. Again, say whatever you want about Penn State. They're a top 10, top 15-ish type of team. Ohio State beat them. They got 2 wins against top 15-ish teams. That's pretty good. They've also won all their other games against inferior competition. They obviously play Michigan coming up at the end of the year, so that whole who's better than who or who should be ranked where will work itself out. The winner of that game will finish ranked higher than the loser. Doesn't really matter where they're ranked right now, right? We all know that game is coming at the end of the season, but they did handle Penn State this week 20-12 on the road this week for Ohio State at Wisconsin. I've got them at number 2. At number 3, Florida State. Moved them down from 2 to 3. Not really anything to do with the Duke game in particular. More of just a combination of things here for Florida State. They've got, the bad win on the road at Boston College by 2, a bad win at Clemson. And that's not an impressive win. Having to go to overtime to beat Clemson is just not impressive this year. It's just not. Clemson's not a good team. So that's not a good quality win for Florida State. They do have the win over LSU. I do think that's a good win. I do think that's a quality win, and they're undefeated. And I think Florida State's probably going to win the ACC with no more than one loss. So Florida State is likely headed for the playoffs. I've got them at number 3 in this week's ranking. I've got Georgia at 4. I moved them up. I had them at 6 last week. Now, they didn't play, so how did they move up? Well, I had Penn State ranked at 3rd, right? Penn State lost, so clearly they've got to move out and move down. And Washington looked really, really bad for the first time this season at home against a horrible Arizona State team. So I moved Washington. I jumped Georgia ahead of Washington. I had Georgia at 6, Washington at 5, moved Georgia up to 4, bumped Penn State out. That's how I came up with that. I still think Washington's a really good team, but look, why do you think Georgia's ranked 5, 6, 7, 8? I mean, I had Georgia all the way down at 8 a couple of weeks ago. I punished teams for bad wins. This was a bad win for Washington. So not necessarily punished because I kept them at 5. I could have moved them up to 4, though, with the Penn State loss. Instead, I decided to jump Georgia up. Got Georgia at 4, Washington at 5. Georgia, of course, off this past week. They play Florida this coming weekend. Washington on the road at Stanford. At number 6, I've got Oklahoma. That's up 1 spot from last week. Again, not because of anything Oklahoma did, because that was not an impressive win Oklahoma had this past weekend. UCF, not a good team, a 3-game losing streak coming into that game. Oklahoma had to hang on to beat them 31-29, 2-point loss, 2-point win, dodged a 2-point conversion that would have tied it up at the end, then dodged an onside kick that would have given UCF an opportunity to get the ball back. But nevertheless, Oklahoma wins. They remain undefeated at 7-0. They're on the road this coming week at Kansas. They're at number 6. Texas at 7. People can continue to get mad at me. I still think Texas is a better team than Oklahoma. However, I've seen these two teams play, and I saw Oklahoma beat them. So I've got Oklahoma ranked ahead of Texas. So the fact that I think Texas is better than Oklahoma is not outweighing the fact that I actually saw the two teams play and saw Oklahoma win. So again, what I think is irrelevant in terms of who would win a rematch. I've seen them play. Oklahoma won. I've got Oklahoma at 6, Texas at 7. Texas also struggled this week on the road at Houston, winning 31-24. They host BYU this coming week. Quinn Ewers out at Texas for a couple of weeks, they're saying. Quarterback, a AC sprain, makes a shoulder sprain. We'll see. Texas has a couple of tough games down the stretch here. Obviously, you want to get Quinn Ewers back if you can. Malik Murphy's going to get the start for them at quarterback. He's looked pretty good when he has played. We'll see, but just something to keep an eye on there with Texas. I've got Oregon at 8. They stayed the same as last week. They beat Washington State 38-24. They play on the road this week in a big game at Utah. This is going to be a good game. This will be the best defense I think Oregon has played this season. Of course, Utah has went ahead and announced that Cameron Rising is going to take a medical red shirt. He's not going to play the rest of the year, so that's going to hamper them offensively. They have struggled to score points at times this season. Utah has. Oregon, I believe, will be favored in that game, and it's a must-win for Oregon. Oregon was a must-win for Utah as well. Utah still just has the one loss. You see I've got Utah ranked down there at 12. They still just have that one loss. So we'll see. Huge game between Utah and Oregon. It's probably an elimination game there for not only playoffs, but probably for Pac-12 title hopes too. A benefit for Utah to have that game at home, but big one coming up for Oregon. I've got them at 8. Penn State, I decided to drop them down to 9. It's hard for me to – Penn State looked impressive. the first 6 weeks of the season. Their offense, believe it or not, and I know a lot of people didn't watch Penn State until this weekend, and so this is hard to believe, but their offense was ranked to the top 10 in points per game. Drew Aller looked bad. He looked lost, confused. I've talked about it a lot already. He did not look good. I'm worried about Penn State in any big game they play. The good news is if you're a Penn State fan, there's only one big game left, and that's the Michigan game. I still think Penn State is better than everybody they play, not named Ohio State and Michigan. So, unfortunately for Penn State, it looks like another 10-2 year to me. But I dropped them down to number 9. I had them at number 3 last week. I've been pretty high on Penn State. I thought Drew Aller was kind of the missing piece they've been waiting on in terms of catching up or passing Ohio State and Michigan. And it just hasn't been the case. Drew Aller did not look good at all. They lost to Ohio State 20-12. They play Indiana at home this coming week. I've got Penn State at 9. I've got Oregon State at 10. I think they're 11 in the AP poll. So this may sound, what you might say, Oregon State in the top 10. They're 11, I think, in the AP. I mean, Oregon State has looked like a pretty good team. Again, another Pac-12 team with just the one loss. Now, a lot of these teams in the Pac-12 that are bunched together play each other down the stretch here over the next 4 or 5 weeks, whether you're talking about your Oregon States, your Washingtons, your Oregons, your Utahs, your UCLAs, even your Southern Cal, who sort of, we've been clowning them. They've lost 2 in a row. Southern Cal's got the ability to beat some of these teams and ruin their seasons too. So it's going to be a train wreck of a season here the last 4 or 5 weeks in the Pac-12. But right now I've got Oregon State at 10. They're 6-1. They didn't play this past week, and they play on the road this coming week at Arizona. I've got Alabama at 11. That's up 1 spot from last week. I had Alabama at 12 last week. They beat Tennessee at home in a nice come from behind win for the Gumps, outscoring Tennessee 27-0 in the second half of that one to pull away in the second half. They ended up winning by 2 scores. They're off this week, as is LSU, and then those 2 teams play the week after that. So that'll be a huge game. The winner of that game most likely will win the SEC West, but I've got Alabama at 11. Utah I've got at 12, also up 1 spot from last week. They beat Southern Cal again for what seems like the 100th year in a row, 34-32. And like I mentioned earlier, they play Oregon this coming week at home. So a huge game for Utah. Ole Miss I've got at 13. They beat Auburn 28-21 on the road. They play Vandy at home this coming week. They should win that. And then is it Georgia the following week for them, or 2 weeks later? They play Georgia in Athens. It might be 3 weeks down the road. But anyway, they've got Georgia coming up on the road. That'll be a big game. They still play Texas A&M. Is that right? Or is it? Yeah, I think they still play Texas A&M. Anyway, they've got a couple of tough games left. Ole Miss does. But right now, they only have the 1 loss on the road at Bama. So another one. There's a lot of 1-loss teams right now that feel like they're kind of dangling from a string. Ole Miss is one of them. Bama's one of them. A couple of Pac-12 teams. Second loss, of course, terminal in terms of making the college football playoffs. So we'll see if Ole Miss can hang on to just that 1 loss. That would make that game in Athens coming up in a few weeks huge. But I've got Ole Miss at 13. I've got North Carolina at 14. Embarrassing loss. There's just no other way to describe it. I had them at 8 last week, losing to a really, really bad Virginia team. That might be the most embarrassing loss of the season that I've seen in the Power 5, to be honest. That loss from North Carolina. Virginia's just a horrific team. You lose to them 31-27. They got to turn around this week and go on the road to a struggling Georgia Tech team. I've got Notre Dame at 15. They were on a bye this week after beating Southern Cal the previous week, so I left them alone. I had them 15 last week, 15 again this week. They've got a couple of difficult games left on their schedule. This week they host Pittsburgh, but they still play, I know, Clemson down the road. So we'll see. Notre Dame sitting there with 2 losses right now at 6-2. At 16, I've got LSU. They're 6-2 as well. And their offense is really, really good. Their defense, it feels like, could let them down in almost any game they play. They are a similarly built team this year anyway as Southern Cal. Really good offense that's capable of scoring a bunch of points with a really, really good Heisman-level QB in Jaden Daniels, and a defense that you just have to hold your breath every single time the other team runs a play. They beat Army this past weekend 62-0. I mentioned before, they're off this coming week before playing on the road in Tuscaloosa. the week after. I've got Missouri at 17. Hard to get a pulse on Missouri. Not talked about a lot. Kind of out of the blue team. They're 7-1. They've got a couple of good wins. They beat a pretty good Kansas State team earlier in the year. We'll see if they can keep it going. They also have a trip to Athens, Georgia, coming up in a couple of weeks. Georgia's schedule looks a lot tougher now down the stretch than it did at the beginning of the season. Georgia's next 4 games in a row are Florida, Missouri, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. So it looks a lot tougher for the Dogs right now than it did in the offseason. But I've got Missouri at 17, 7-1. They destroyed South Carolina this past weekend, 34-12, and they have a bye week coming up, an extra week to prepare for that Georgia game. Missouri at 17. I've got Louisville at 18. They were off this past week. They play Duke this coming week. That'll be a good game. Louisville, again, inexplicable loss to Pittsburgh last week. Is currently their only loss of the season. Them versus Duke could be a really, really good game coming up this weekend. I've got Tulane at 19. They have become my highest ranked group of 5 team. They've only got 1 loss, I believe. They're 6-1. They beat North Texas 35-28. They play on the road at Rice this coming weekend. Tulane, James Madison, Air Force. Seems like one of those 3 teams going to end up being the best group of 5 team this year. I've got Tulane at 19. Duke I've got to 20. They suffered their second loss of the season on the road at Florida State. Riley Leonard re-injured his ankle late in that game. I'm not sure it really would have mattered. Florida State just wore Duke down. Riley Leonard maybe gave Duke some sort of extra motivation overall, but in terms of his individual performance, it wasn't great. He had 80 total yards in that game and no touchdowns before he had to leave the game after re-injuring his ankle in the fourth quarter, and Florida State pulled away at the end. But I've got Duke at 20. They're 5-2. They lost to Florida State 38-20 on the road at Louisville this coming week. I've got UCLA at 21. They're 5-2. They beat Stanford 42-7 this past weekend, and they host Colorado this coming weekend. Be an interesting game. Colorado on a losing streak and desperately trying to make a bowl game. This is one of those games that feels like Colorado needs to try to find a win if they want to make a bowl. UCLA, of course, will have other plans, but I've got UCLA at 21. 22 is where I landed on Tennessee. I had them at 17 last week. Disappointing second half for them on the road at Bama, and they tote the Giant L. Had to drop them down to 22. 34-20 they lost to Bama. Doesn't get any easier for them on the road at Kentucky this coming week. Should be a physical game, line of scrimmage game. Tennessee, I think, has the obvious advantage in this game at the skill positions. We'll see if Kentucky can run the ball on Tennessee. If they're able to run the ball, they could keep it close. It could be a great game, Tennessee and Kentucky. If Kentucky's not able to run the ball against that Tennessee defense, then it's going to be hard for Kentucky to do anything because that Devin Leary is just horrendous at quarterback for Kentucky this year. But, Tennessee on the road at Kentucky this coming weekend. I've got Air Force at 23. They remained undefeated. They beat Navy this past weekend 17-6, and they're on the road at Colorado State this coming week. James Madison new into my top 25 this week. I've got them at 24, and they're undefeated, 7-0. They beat Marshall 20-9. They host Old Dominion this coming week. They'll probably win that one too. Improved to 8-0. James Madison, a pretty good team. Only been an FBS team for a couple of years and looking pretty good already. Kansas State, I had them into my top 25 earlier, dropped them out after they lost a game or two. Got them back in now, though. They might be the 3rd best team in the Big 12. Or the 4th. Oklahoma State has looked pretty good the last couple of weeks, too, but I've got Kansas State rounding out my top 25. There you go. My updated top 25 rankings. Make sure you let me know down below where you disagree and what you think I got wrong. I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good morning.